So if you've been following the discourse around Diablo 4 since Season 14, you'll have probably realized that the Mythic system has been just the biggest point of discussion and contention in the entirety of the game. And while a lot of the big problems with the Mythic system were solved in Season 14, and I think they're even going to get a bit more balanced going into Season 15, I still think there are some pretty massive and fundamental issues with the Mythic system as a whole. And that's what I want to go over in this video, because even though I do think the Mythic system is going to be in a pretty good place in Season 15, I think if there isn't something else coming down the pipeline, specifically a new rarity, I think the Mythic system as it is right now, and considering how it interacts with the rest of the game, should be removed out of the game, and we should go back to the old system of how we used to have uniques. And there are a bunch of caveats with this, and that's what I want to go over in this video. Now, I'm not going to be going over the basics of the Mythic system and how it's changed in Season 14 and how it's going to further change in Season 15. I have multiple previous videos going over all of that, and while we'll still be going over some of that information, this video is not going to be focused on explaining the system itself. I just want to get right into what I think are some of the biggest fundamental issues with this system. The first one being the complete power creep of legendary aspects. And earlier on in Season 14, I don't think a lot of people were talking about this because there was the current acquisition issues, but as we've gone further into Season 14, and as the Season 15 PTR was able to be tested, people I think started realizing that this was one of the biggest issues with the Mythic system. It power crept pretty much everything else. Not only did it just power creep other things of the game, but because of how the legendary aspect system has been since Lord of Hatred, in that it is just basic stat increases and no longer gameplay changes, that because it's just those stat increases, if something is just better stat wise, you just won't use a legendary aspect. And that's what has happened with the Mythic system. Increasing these special effects of unique items by 30% just makes most of them strong enough to power creep past legendary aspects. And I think this is a massive fundamental issue for the game. The legendary aspect system was the main thing Diablo 4 was built around during its development and throughout the entirety of the history of the game so far. And if you look back pre-Lord of Hatred, the legendary aspect system was significantly more impactful. A big reason for this is because a lot of the class or build customization, specifically when it comes to playstyle changes, came from the legendary aspect system. Now, going into Lord of Hatred, they want to remove most of that and add all of those powers into the skill trees. The big problem is that currently, not even close to all of the powers from the legendary aspect system was added into the skill trees. Now, a way in which they could kind of rectify this is just keep adding more customization to the skill tree, even within seasons, which I think is something they should do. But even if they did that, that still doesn't rectify the legendary aspect system being completely power crept. So if they keep the Mythic system, something needs to be done. Either Mythic items need somehow nerfed, and I think that's actually a longer discussion because I think unique items in general may be too strong in terms of their multipliers. So we could just see all of the uniques in the game nerfed as like a rebalancing to the game, which would heavily nerf Mythics in the same way, and that could shore up legendary aspects enough to be usable again. But I don't think that's actually a super interesting way to do this, because that still leaves legendary aspects as just basic stat increases that you had to nerf other stuff to make them not get power crept. And that does heavily play back into Mythics really causing this issue of pretty much removing a rarity out of the game. Now, not every build is going to just have full Mythics, and it'll obviously take you a good amount of time to get full Mythics, but the best in slot for I think a lot of the builds are either going to be full Mythics or almost full Mythics and one, maybe two legendary aspects. Obviously not counting something like a Barbarian that just has a lot more slots, but for most other classes, that's just what it's going to be, because why use a legendary aspect when you could use a Mythic that just gives you more power and potentially gives you some other effect on top of that? And this is one of the biggest reasons why I think the Mythic system should just go back to being just the unique system and having the iconic Mythics just be Mythics. That also doesn't necessarily need to be a thing anymore either. If we went back to the old unique system where every unique could be a Mythic, we wouldn't necessarily need to have the iconic Mythic system going forward because they are making unique versions of those Mythics. I would actually be much more interested in seeing the Mythic rarity, if they were to do this, be something almost completely different. Because realistically, and I went over this in my previous video, the iconic Mythics, or previous to Season 14, just the Mythics, have always been very boring. Like, if you go look at all of those Mythics that we've had throughout the game's history, they're boring. The most interesting one that's actually been used was Shroud of False Death, just because it gave you +1 to all passives, and there were actually some more interesting passives that maybe your build couldn't really invest into, but could open up some new avenues when you got 1 point in all of them for free. But outside of that, everything else is super boring. Grandfather's just a crit increase, Era Perdition was just a crit chance and a damage increase. Ring of Starless Skies is just primarily a damage increase with some resource cost reduction. So pretty much all the Mythics we actually use are just pure power increases. They're not gameplay changing things. They're not really unique in any way, because again, the Grandfather having a special effect of just having a crit multiplier is not unique, and it's even much less unique now when half of our gear, or more than half of our gear, just has crit multipliers on them now. So if they were to do this, remove the Mythic system that we have now and go back just having the unique system, I would much rather see all of the iconic Mythics just keep their unique counterparts, and then the Mythic system be something completely different. Like, make it much more substantial changes to build, maybe even make it some crazy substantial effect that you could only equip one of at a time. Something like that. Something that is just much more interesting. Because that's also one of my main criticisms of a lot of these systems right now, and that a lot of them are just stat increases, and that's kind of boring. Not the base uniques, because when you're using like a bunch of these class uniques, they are actually interesting effects, but the iconic Mythics are just boring stat increases. Legendary aspects are just boring stat increases, and now even the Temperic system is just boring stat increases. I very much think they could do much better with all three of those systems than what we currently have in the game. So I think the two biggest problems with the Mythic system currently is power creeping legendary aspects, which is easily the biggest one and actually a massive issue for the future of the game if nothing is done about it, and also just that it is kind of power creeping the entirety of the game, because the amount of power increase we got from having the new Mythic system is pretty ridiculous. And even though I do think Diablo 4 is actually probably the most balanced of the modern popular ARPGs, I still think adding all of this stuff that just power creeps us even more and just creates an even harder balancing challenge for the developers isn't something that's necessarily good. And while those are the two biggest issues, I do think there is ways they could actually just make the game much better while keeping the Mythic system. Number one is just to redo the legendary aspect system and, in my opinion, put it back to what it was. Not exactly what it was, but add playstyle changing effects to the legendary aspect system. When they were originally talking about this, one of the first things they ever said about the skill tree overhaul before we knew anything about it, this was like a year before we even knew about Lord of Hatred, they talked about wanting to move a lot of the powers from the legendary aspect system into the skill tree. And that's a good change in general, and I think the skill trees now are much better, but they either need to keep expanding those or just add powers back to the legendary aspect system. And I think they should actually do both, because I don't think there is a need to just remove all of these cool effects and all of the playstyle changing effects from the legendary aspect system. It doesn't have to be just one or the other. In fact, a large chunk of the effects from the old legendary aspect system have just been removed from the game. Like, specifically with talking about, let's say, a druid, which is the main class I play, there is legitimately tons and tons of effects that no longer exist for the druid that created a bunch of previous druid builds. that doesn't make any sense. The only way that makes any sense is if they have a plan going into future seasons to keep expanding upon the skill tree and doing it pretty frequently. And again, I'm not talking about just waiting for expansions. I'm talking about we get new skills, new variations, new passive upgrades for our skill tree with new seasons. Because if they just keep it like this is now until like a new expansion, you just removed a ton of stuff from the game that did not need to be removed from the game. Even if it makes the game less balanced, I think more fun and more opportunities to make interesting builds is just significantly more important than making the game more balanced. And even though, like I mentioned, I think Diablo 4 is much more balanced than other ARPGs, it's still not necessarily like a super balanced game. The fact that we have multiple classes hitting 150 pits every season still is a pretty big indicator that the game isn't like super tightly balanced. So there really isn't a reason to not just add in more and more of these cool effects to allow us to create more cool and interesting builds, even if they're not super strong. Now, another way in which they could make the game just much better while keeping the Mythic system is adding a rarity above Mythics. Now, this is something pretty much every other ARPG does. I know some people will probably instantly say that you're just kind of invalidating other rarities, but I think with the cube now and all of the rarities, or pretty much all of them, actually having uses and continuing to have uses, I think adding another rarity above Mythics is not a bad thing. If you go look at something like Last Epoch, they have crazy amount of rarities. You go look at a lot of other ARPGs and they have more rarities than Diablo 4, and I think having a much more specialized rarity above Mythics would make the game better while keeping the Mythic system. I went over some options in my previous video. You could even look back at the original Mythic rarity, because if you go back before Diablo 4 was launched, the first rarities they talked about essentially went what we have now. Then they had legendary and set items in the same rarity. Then they had ancient versions of those, which is kind of essentially a mix of greater affixes and ancestral items. But then they also had the highest rarity back then being a red Mythic rarity that just had 4 legendary effects on it back before legendary effects were legendary aspects. So you would have had to gotten a specific legendary item to get its effect. And these Mythic items, you'd only be able to equip one of them, but it had 4 of those effects. They could also do something like that. And even thinking more about it, essentially adding that into the game now could be really cool if they had it be like old legendary aspects where it had like playstyle changing effects and you just got a handful of them on these Mythic items. And what I think that could actually be is they add this new rarity above Mythic where it's these named items, maybe super rare, or maybe actually rare but still somewhat more common to get, where maybe it had like 3 or 4 legendary effects on it that were all focused on gameplay or play style changing effects and not increases to your damage, just like gameplay changing stuff. And there were kind of curated roles. So when you went and got, say, a Mythic necklace that's named this thing, it would always be the same exact role. And now you have these 3 other playstyle changing effects that would allow you to not only have something different than just having all Mythics equipped, but could bring back some intrigue into the legendary aspect system. Or maybe you get this new rarity of item and it has like a couple legendary aspects that are always on it, and then maybe you could add another legendary aspect on it or something like that to make legendary aspects more impactful, because you would always want to have one of these things equipped. And that's just one possible option for another rarity. There's a ton of other stuff they could do to make the game more interesting while keeping the Mythic system. And even though while saying that, I still think they should just remove the Mythic system or change a lot of the other systems of the game in big ways, because I still think even if you do that, even if you add a really interesting new rarity above Mythics, the problem still is that legendary aspects are pretty much power crept unless you like nerf uniques and Mythics or add playstyle changing stuff back into the legendary aspect system. One of those things really needs to be done unless they're just going to remove the legendary aspect system. I could potentially actually see them doing that, removing the legendary aspect system and just kind of adding a different rarity to do something different. Instead of just like pure power, you do something different, so it kind of forces you or makes you want to equip those other rarities. Because as of right now, as I mentioned, I think we're just going to get more and more into every build is using all Mythics and that's it for every build, and that gets very boring. So I do think they should remove the Mythic system or do some fundamental fundamental changes like I've talked about in this video. Now, we do have BlizzCon coming up very shortly. There's a bunch of surprises we have for that. I'm sure past showing us what Season 15 is actually going to be. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of other stuff for the future of the game that they're going to be showing us. So I'm hoping we get some answers or some big reveals going into BlizzCon. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.